Good morning. How is everyone? Welcome. So went a little long in the first lecture in terms of what I wanted to cover in that time. I still wanted to look at the setting here and the situation to get a feel of the texture of this world. We've talked about its structure, its political, its social structure, and the various strategies it uses to control people. We've said at the center of this story, I'm going to say really at the center of this story is a love story or an attempted love story. I mean, what's more interesting, real love stories or attempted love stories where things don't always work out or where it's not evident that they're going, as opposed to like the romantic comedy where everything is very cute and happily ever after all with no real problems, just little annoyances and things like that. This is real, the real world, the kind of dilemma of these people. And when you think about freedom, Americans cherish their freedoms. Our nation is founded on the principle of a certain type of freedom or liberty, or maybe what's often called ordered liberty, which means not absolute freedom, but freedom to do what you want, so long as you're permitting other people to do what they want, which means do no harm, essentially freedom up to the point of do no harm to other human beings. It's not often that we ever think that our freedoms have to do with permission to love and to feel and to think the way we'd like to love, feel, and think, because we take it for granted that these kinds of things would never be touched by society, precisely because we live in a free society, and precisely because we have, as part of that conception of freedom, a sphere of privacy circumscribing the most intimate aspects of our life that permit us to live behind closed doors and to think and to feel and to express behind closed doors what we'd want to, right? This is a world in which the door can close, but there really are no closed doors. There is no place separate from the view or the gaze or the surveillance of the regime. Right? So I just want to read the first handful of pages that really lay out some of the key themes and the key issues, but also just the texture of this world. And it's actually a world that looks very much like the images of totalitarian regimes that have actually existed in the 20th century. So just to recap, three main concepts or themes that we saw from Lecture 1. A totalitarian society in which the state has a kind of total or attempted total control over the life of its citizens. And I said at the heart of this form of totalitarianism is something profoundly disturbing, which is control not only over our external actions, but control over our internal thoughts and feelings. This might be seen as the most radical form of totalitarianism. We also said this, if a society really wanted, an elite wanted to control people, what better way than to control their minds so that they don't have to control their actions? The people will control themselves. And as part of that is the self-surveillance involved in this thing called the Panopticon. Panopticon literally was the structure of a prison devised in the middle of the 19th century by a famous philosopher and social thinker by the name of Jeremy Bentham, and it created a circular prison in which all the jail cells were in a radius around a central focal point, the center of the circle, in which a guard sat, such that the guard had a 360-degree view, and that they could look into any prison cell, and that there would be no place or domain of concealment for the prisoner. And the consequence of this is that they were always aware of either being surveilled or the possibility of being surveilled, right? And part of the way this was actually designed was for it, and this is something specifically in Bentham's explanation and drawings of this thing, was that you would never know when you're actually being surveilled, because the guard would be behind a kind of partition and the guard station set up in a way where you couldn't see whether the guard was looking at you. So therefore you have to assume he always could be looking at you. And this panopticon sets up the principle of what in the 20th century was called Panopticon Ism. Now, what is Panopticon Ism? It is the psychological consequence of of being surveilled, or the thought that you could be surveilled constantly, right? And two things happen. One comes to recognize that there is no private space to be had. There is no concealment. There is no private behind closed doors existence. And when you're behind those closed doors, you act differently than when you're on display to the guard, right? And as the consequence of this, we begin to surveil ourselves and regulate our own behavior, because the psychological principle of panopticonism has started to be internalized, and we start to regulate our own conduct, whether the guard is viewing or not. Now you can see this is really a version of the all-seeing God made incarnate in the form of social control. The basic principle of at least the Jewish and the Christian God is that God sees everything, so that even when the police, for example, aren't looking, that you're going to regulate your behavior, because if you don't get thrown in jail in this world, you'll be punished in the next, since God made a note of it and wrote it down and filed that away for when you pass on, right? So here we have really a mortal, a this worldly version of a kind of all-seeing God that surveils, right? And Winston, because he has a sense of, I think the best word is interiority. He has despite the mechanisms of control in the society, they're not absolute. There's not, there is clearly a certain amount of wiggle room. And of course, we'll find out that they've even accommodated for those people who psychologically slip through the cracks and haven't turned into self-surveilling sheep. People who think for themselves are obviously going to be the threat to this regime. Now, it's funny today, the very same people are considered a threat to our media and our social media. Those people who think for themselves and don't accept the narratives that they've been given by the media are considered very threatening, and they're given names that are inconsistent with the kinds of things they're actually talking about. So this is absolutely pertinent to our moment in time. If you're someone who, I'll give you one example. YouTube, which is owned by Google, the umbrella Google company, Alphabet. Alphabet has had a long-standing relationship with China, done business with them, and Google was actually planning to build a massive internet system in China. Now, they said that this program ended, but it's not clear that it did. And secondly, they said that it was just an internet program where it was likely a surveillance system. If you know anything about China, you know that there is massive state censorship of the internet in China, and that the Chinese people do not have access to information from the outside world. They only have the information that the Chinese government and the people, which really means the Chinese Communist Party, they only have the information that they're allowed to see as per what's acceptable to the Chinese Communist Party. And what we're talking about here, folks, is no different than the church, the Catholic Church, burning books that were considered threatening to you, 500 years ago, right? The point is, YouTube is currently censoring any publications that raise questions about the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, which effectively recently carried China's water in saying to the world that the virus that was coming out of China could not be transmitted from human to human, but only from within animals, and therefore that human beings had nothing to worry about. And this was being stated at a time when Taiwan, who is a nation that's quasi-independent from China, and this has to do with the history of the Communist Revolution and that the people who were anti-communist fled to the island of Taiwan. So at the very moment the WHO was claiming that the coronavirus was no big deal, nothing to see here, Taiwan was saying, we are getting information from China that says this is not only passing from human being to human being, but that it's proliferating like wildfire, and that this is a serious threat to global health of all nations, right? And the WHO said explicitly no. And even more recently, there were documents and information that came out from intelligence services, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, what's called the Five Eyes intelligence, that said that China had compelled the WHO to not say anything about what was going on in their country, right? And now you have YouTube, ostensibly an American company, that is censoring any video that says anything critical about the WHO, which is the World Health Organization. So if you think that anything that's going on in this book doesn't happen in the world today, and I don't mean to either scare you, nor absolutely I do not mean to make you cynical about the world around you, rather to make you informed, and also give you a sense of, let's be clear, to give you a sense of injustice, that this is not what we expect from our nation. This is not what we expect from American companies. This is not what we expect from Americans. When you look at the unfreedoms around the world, you'll come to the very simple conclusion that the freedoms that we have in our country are worth preserving, but you'll also come to the realization that in many ways they're under serious threat. And if American citizens cannot appreciate that, they will get the government that they deserve, right? And I wanted to make even a more serious point, that the failed love relationship between these two characters, the turning them against one another, is a strategy of tyranny that we've seen go right back to the description of the Persian tyranny in Pausanias' speech in the Symposium, and also the strategy of a tyrant, which is to divide and conquer on the most intimate levels that we saw Zeus in trying to deal with those pesky humanoid spherical creatures, because they had become too powerful, right? Now, what I'm showing you here is a scene from the 1984 film called 1984 with John Hurt and Richard Burton. It is an excellent film, and it is a very fair characterization of the book. And in fact, I really strongly encourage you to watch it in concert with the book. It paints a very vivid picture of this world, and it's fairly accurate to the book. It has to leave out certain chunks. It doesn't clarify what's going on with Winston's past, his past and his childhood that he's trying to recover through the use of this diary. But it gives you some sense of the feel of this society. And here you see a picture of the Telescreen in his apartment space, in which he finds this little niche, a little cranny, a little nook or cranny that allows him to not be seen by the Telescreen. So he thinks he's in the Panopticon, right? This Telescreen is the modified, updated 21st century version of the Panopticon. But now, instead of having a central guard tower, what do you have? You have a centralized internet in which the state is in control of it. Sounds like China to me. In which, instead of having to face everybody in, there's a tentacle, a coaxial cable, right? A bunch of wires going out to everyone's house with a camera and a microphone to see and surveil everyone. And he thinks, by getting in this niche that you see depicted here, him over off in the corner, and you imagine the camera of the Telescreen coming out just like in the direction the image facing out, he imagines he can't be seen, and that therefore he's going to be able to surreptitiously write in this book and do it in a clandestine way. And of course he's given himself a false sense of security. But perhaps just the fact that he believes that he's not being surveilled is what permits him to start being, you might even say, a human being, and to reflect on his own life, to try to grasp his own identity. What was the basic claim I made in the last lecture? That his confrontation comes with the regime through his own concern for himself, and he realizes the way the regime is inhibiting him discovering his own self, his own identity. And here we see tremendous parallel with the second discourse. The second discourse puts forward these ideas of merit and beauty that everyone is forced to conform to, ones that can't possibly be perfectly consistent with our own natural inclinations. And what they do is not only force us to live up to standards that aren't our own, but they suppress or repress our own natural inclinations, which Rousseau sees as good, and that therefore we lose a sense of who we truly are. It's a really powerful argument, a really powerful argument. And what is Winston trying to do with this diary? He is trying to discover himself through recollection, right? If you think about what is a human being, we're not just what we're doing in the moment, but we're the sum total of our history. And to some extent, that history is just embedded in us because we've gone through it. So we don't have to think about it to be that history. On the other hand, if we can't remember certain things, if we don't have mnemonics, external devices of recollection to help our recollection, we're going to, it's amazing how one can lose a sense of one's own identity. This regime has done this on the individual level and also on the collective level. The collective history of the regime is constantly being rewritten to serve the purposes of the party. Whatever the party says is true is true. That is their standard of the truth, right? That is their standard of the truth. And why do they consider certain things true? Well, simply because those are the facts, or those are the falsehoods that advance the party's power. It's as simple as that. But in the process, the entire self-identity of the people is suppressed and controlled. Winston, not only does he have a kind of life of the mind, not only does he love words and good writing, but he loves what words represent. And at the heart of writing is words representing reality, or words representing the truth of things, right? And he has a curiosity, an intellectual curiosity coupled with, what does Aristotle say in the beginning of the Metaphysics? Every human being has the capacity and natural desire to know. We have a natural desire to want to be in conformity with the truth of things, rather than some false image of them. Now that, of course, contrasts with the concept of ignorance is bliss. And if you've seen the movie The Matrix, you know, this world in which everyone's mind is controlled because they live, actually their minds are living in a virtual reality that's very sumptuous and for the most part enjoyable. There's this great scene where this character, he's aware, one of the big things about that movie is that people are not aware that they're even in this system of control. There's a character who's aware that there's a system of control, and he's within the matrix in this digital virtual reality, and he's having a glass of wine and having some steak, and he knows that this is all just an illusion, a creation of this kind of massive digital supercomputer. But he says, damn, this steak tastes good right now, and damn, this wine tastes good. And you know, obviously there are people who don't care for the truth. But I would say that, you know, the justice of a regime, you can look at the justice of a society based on their degree of concern for the truth and whether they can, quote unquote, handle the truth. I would argue that with our obsession with political correctness and so-called hate speech, that we really don't value the truth in our society that highly, and that it's being, that diminution of, you know, political correctness and talk of hate speech is supposed to be a great moral position. It's moral outrage against bigotry and all these things. But concern for the truth is also a moral prerogative, or a category, or a moral imperative, right? So Winston, in trying to get the truth of his own life, right, starts to understand the way in which the control of the truth by the regime is directly inhibiting him from being who he is and, of course, affecting his happiness. And the fact is, he sees that. He actually sees that. That's happening to everybody, but not everyone is seeing that, right? So what I'd like to do is to read the opening passages to give a flavor of the text here. Just on page 1 here, chapter 1, right at the beginning. That's a nice place to start. You begin at the beginning. It says, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. That, for us, that would be 1 o'clock. Winston, his chin nuzzled in his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, and though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him." So, if you've ever seen pictures of Soviet regimes and heard people talk about it, you'll notice that like everything is gray. In the Soviet Union in particular, everything had and East Germany, right? You go look at pictures of the architecture and everything is gray and drab and slightly depressing. And this, right here, we're getting this picture painted of this drab, gray, cold world. And yes, it's a certain time of year. It's April, where the weather's changing, where it's not particularly pleasant just yet. But I think that weather is also designed to characterize the kind of psychological feel of this world. Gritty, dirt, dusty, papers flying around. Things are in disorder. Things are not well kept. Nobody takes any concern with these things. People have lost the concern to take care of the world around them. He goes through the glass doors of Victory Mansions. Now, of course, this is where he lives. He's coming home from a jaunt out on the street, like you would in New York. These are Victory Mansions. Sounds very glorified. And we'll talk about newspeak and its use of euphemism, which is a kind of false positive name for something that doesn't deserve it. And these are clearly not mansions. This is more like a third world hovel, or a structure that was once a kind of very comfortable, maybe kind of middle class dwelling that is now in a decrepit state because they only have the bare basics of life. And you'll notice that in the food and what they drink and the things they have. They only have the basic necessities. I mean, communism. What do human beings really need? Capitalism, all this greed and want and all these fancy things. You don't need those things to survive. You only need the things of mere life. That should be perfectly sufficient for a human being. Because your love of the party and the moral beauty of this regime should certainly be sufficient for you. So it's a complete euphemism. These are not mansions. And then the word victory. And of course, this is an echo, this book written in 1949, this is an echo of the victory of World War II. This for us is a peace sign, but of course, it actually was a V sign for victory that Winston Churchill used during World War II. And it's been appropriated by this regime, which of course is, it was once called England. And they have turned the meaning of this, they're in a constant war, so it brings forth the perpetual military conflict that's invoked, that they're constantly seeking victory, although it never ends. It also seems to be the victory of the party. It's not the people, but the party at large. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It displayed simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man of about 45, with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. So that, of course, is an image of Big Brother on a poster that's really designed for like a billboard outside, but it expresses the kind of scale psychically of this figure in the mind of the citizens. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present the electric current was shut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. You don't need all that gas. You don't need all that electricity. You don't need all that, whatever you might be using for your appliance. You don't need an elevator. These are all superfluous capitalist inventions to make mankind decadent, right? You just need the bare bones of existence, gray, paint peeling off the wall. That should be enough for you. And if everybody's equal, finally we've achieved that great utopian society where everyone is equally poor. The flat was 7 flights up. He had a lot of walking to do. And Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer, or vein, above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. So he's in very poor shape. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazing from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you around when you move. Big Brother is watching you. The caption ran beneath it. So we get thrown into some important facts about the story quite immediately. The way in which Big Brother, it's just a poster on every floor, and every time he makes it up the next flight of stairs and then he takes a rest, he's taking a rest next to this giant image of Big Brother, who conspicuously has echoes of Hitler with the mustache, but is a kind of anglicized, meaning English, anglicized version of Hitler that would be like a culturally appropriate image, for the British. So whenever we see the Hitler mustache and Hitler's face, unquestionably associate it solely with Germany and Nazi Germany. We wouldn't be able to transpose that image to America. I suppose today the face would be an orange face of Donald Trump and with the funny hair, and maybe you could put a mustache on him. But maybe Donald Trump is so singular as being presented as a kind of fascist dictator that he wouldn't even need the mustache. That's something to consider. Inside the flat and fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat through the words, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. Okay, so there's no instance where you see him going into his apartment, but it's a flat. A flat is just a British word for an apartment, right? And as he's entering, he hears the telescreen, and he hears it because it doesn't go off. And so he turns it down. So you notice that the telescreen is two ways. It's on one hand propaganda, and on the other hand surveillance, and those two go to work hand in hand to control. It's constantly in your ear. It's constantly seeping, the message from it is constantly seeping into your psyche. And what are they concerned about? They're talking about, this would be like, every month and every quarter there's like an economic report that the government produces, tell you how jobs are doing and how, banking is doing and business is expanding or contracting. So here one of the two main themes that they have on display of propaganda on the telescreen are what's going on in the war, and then economic production, and particularly economic production connected not with the bounty of society and benefiting everyone at large, but benefiting the war effort. So you think of something like iron being central to building tanks and planes and what have you, military armaments, right? And it also raises another point, which is that the function of this regime is geared toward control. The two ends are control and war turns out to be a function to control. Think about the ends of society in the Greek polis, Aristotle, Plato. The goal is human excellence. Now, first of all, you cannot have human excellence without a sufficient amount of freedom. Human excellence is really just another way of talking about the fulfillment of human nature, right? human nature necessitates freedom on the one hand. You do not have a human life. If freedom is a distinct aspect or dimension of human nature, if you do not have freedom, you do not have a distinctly human life. You have the life of an animal. And we see Winston here is living in many ways like a caged animal. And he lives in a flat, which is a whole series of cages, right? And then the other thing is, you need the freedom to fulfill excellence. You need to have the opportunity, right? And then it's up to you to make the most of it. And we talked about that the polis is the authoritative or complete community precisely because it has within its division of labor all the necessary components to satisfy the development of the body and the mind of the human being. And the priority, really, I mean, you need the things of the body. You need food, you need shelter, yes. But once you have those in place, the real thing that matters are the arts and sciences. All those things that cultivate the soul and the mind of the human being. This world has none of that. This world has economic production. The needs of mere life, the needs of war, which are the needs of like military physical force, economy. It's really connected with economy, right? And so everything is oriented toward a war effort. And what's interesting is you could read about the so-called war on terror. You could read about the consequences during World War II of the government of Franklin Delano Roosevelt having to orient its entire political agenda toward preparation and execution, a prosecution of war, right? And that it literally transformed society, because when the government and the military goes on a war footing, society also goes on a war footing. And you lose certain freedoms. The government, for example, stepped in to direct private companies to manufacture certain things. You actually see this now. You saw the president declare the coronavirus situation actually a war, and he actually used powers that had been established under laws for FDR to mobilize society, powers that would never exist under normal circumstances, that ostensibly impinge on the freedom of individuals and businesses to operate as they see fit. I mean, I'll give you one example. We're considered to be in a kind of war footing against an invisible enemy, kind of hidden scourge. And governors have said, we have the power to shut down businesses. We have the power to prevent people from going to church, right, in the name of public health, right? That is a powerful thing to do. And they've also said that there have been a number of politicians, this could last for years. This could last for years, right? Bill de Blasio said, if certain Jewish synagogues try to have services on the Sabbath, I won't just make sure they're closed, I will permanently close them. Think about that. Think about that. Think about what that really means. And think about how that squares with the First Amendment. Do you know what the First Amendment says? And if you don't, I suggest you read it and think about the implications. He moved to the other window, a smallish, frail figure, the meekness of his own body, merely emphasized by the blue overalls, which were the uniform of the party. So nobody is permitted any individuality. You wear a uniform. And the thing that's striking about this uniform is overalls are, this is the outfit, historically, going back to the 19th century, this is the outfit of a laborer, manual laborer, right? And this actually isn't what Winston does. He's a thinker of the mind. Even O'Brien, the inner party member, has a similar, very drab, very boring outfit. And this is actually consistent with communist regimes. Number one, they want to take away your individuality because you express yourself through your clothes. And if you think that's insignificant, imagining living in a world where you had to wear an ugly, boring uniform every single day of your life, and the psychological impact that would have on you and everyone else. In the Nazi concentration camps, they shaved people's hair off their heads, specifically to strip them of their identity, which was connected with their appearance and how they wore their hair, right? And also, of course, to humiliate them, right? To reduce them to a kind of subhuman status. You'll also notice that, I mean, I've said it, but that this outfit is the outfit of the worker, because communism ostensibly was supposed to be the revolution of the proletariat, the working industrial class, to overthrow the elites and the bourgeois, the business owners, and so on and so forth, because the business owners were considered by Marx to be essentially slave owners, right? They made surplus labor off the backs of the laborers, and because they owned the factory, they basically got free money that was taken from the sweat of the worker, right? You can learn about the concept of surplus value, which is capitalist profit, right? That's invested so the capitalist can make more money. It's a diabolical scheme. Outside, and even though the window pane was shut, the world looked cold. Down in the streets, little eddies of wind were whirling, dust and torn paper in spirals. And though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. So you'll see this in communist, the best movie you should see, it's called The Lives of Others. The Lives of Others. And it will depict this drab color scheme of Soviet East Germany before the reunification. And so the point here is everything is a gray. There's no color. It's dirty, it's sooty, and then these posters have this dramatic graphic designing with color, maybe red, that stands out, and it pops out from everything else in the environment, whether inside or outside. The black, mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. So I said before that the eyes seem to move with you, and of course this is really just a kind of metaphor for the fact that people are constantly surveilled, and they feel like they're constantly being surveilled, right? It's kind of like the feeling of that person breathing down the back of your neck, right? There was one on the house front, immediately opposite. So he's looking out the window and he sees it on the other building. Big Brother is watching you. So notice this is the second time in a page that this expression, Big Brother is watching you, because it's being hammered into every citizen that Big Brother is watching you. One of the great techniques, quote unquote great techniques of the media, is to constantly hammer in your mind the same thing over and over and over and over again until you just kind of subconsciously accept it, even if you don't consciously accept it. So, for example, for 3 years we were told Russian collusion, Russian collusion, Russian collusion. But it came out just last week that everyone who has publicly stated Russian collusion, when they were under oath in House committee hearings, they all acknowledged that they had no evidence of Russian collusion, and they even acknowledged that what they said in public on television was not consistent with the truth of what they actually knew. And that is just stunning, that these interviews were actually done in 2017, and we've had 3 years of talking about Russian collusion and how the Russians are going to steal all our elections, right? It's amazing. This is what's going on right now in our country is the greatest political scandal in our country. And you know what, folks? It's not even close. Watergate, by comparison, looks like a guy who robbed toilet paper from the bodega. Seriously. And the scandal is not just our politicians, but the scandal is also our media. Our media really, we'll talk more about propaganda when we look at Newspeak, but our media was complicit and part of a conspiracy to sell this fake story about Russian collusion that has turned out to be completely made up. And the original sources have even acknowledged that there was no factual basis to the claims that were made. These are the people who apparently supposedly produced quote unquote intelligence on this story. It turns out it was basically just a bunch of stories that people heard as rumors that were turned into excuses to spy on a presidential candidate, a a president-elect, and then a president while sitting in office. Down at the street level, another poster, torn at the corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word, INSOC. Now, of course, on itself, INSOC it's like gobbledygook. It's just a word, right? But it actually means English socialism. And here we're talking about basically kind of social communism. You know, the distinction between socialism and communism are very ambiguous, and nobody's really totally clarified them. There really is no absolute distinction between the two, because it's all a matter of how these words are defined, and there's certain flexibility in them. But the point is, this socialism is basically, you know, Soviet-style Marxism. And one interesting fact that, I mean, England had been one of the great progenitors, not just at home, but around the world, of various types of socialism, going back to the 19th century. In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrol did not matter, however. Only the thought police mattered. So they're not interested, this regime, in just peering into your window of your house. They're interested, into peering into your mind. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the over-fulfillment of the 9 third-year plan. Now, this 3-year plan is based on Stalin. He had what were called 5-year plans, and they developed, the beginning of Stalin his regime, the new economic program, the NEP, which was designed to completely centralize the control of the economy, and basically map out in advance incremental number of years that would basically direct the entire economy. So every time on the telescreen they talk about the economy, they talk about how they planned for X amount, but they produced way more than they actually did. And here's the thing, in this world you're just seeing it, it's like ours. It all comes through a screen. You have no clue what the relationship is between what's on that screen and the real world, because all of these types of facts you only get through the screen. That should be a warning to all of us. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. Now, this is exactly the principle of the Panopticon. You have the capacity to be surveilled 24/7, 365. But you never actually know whether the information that's available to them, which is to say your life, they're actually looking at it. But precisely because you're always surveilled, you have to be under the assumption that they're always looking. Right? How often or on what system the thought police plugged in or at any individual wire was a guess. So Orwell is imagining this. You guys probably not even aware of it, but in the olden days, when you made a telephone call, and this is before my time, you would call the operator and you would say, hook me up with number blah, blah, blah. And what they would actually do is they had an operator's board with switches and plug holes, and they would take the plug that goes into your phone line, like plugging in your headphones or something, right? You'd plug into the one person's phone line, and you take the other cable and you plug it into your phone line, and you'd be connected, literally. So when the operator connects you, it was literally a connection. So here the idea is that if they want to pull up the information on your screen, they plug into yours, and then that information is fed to them. It's always capable of being fed. Now imagine how primitive this is. This is the cutting edge technology today, but imagine how primitive this is compared to a computerized system today. in which all of this can be surveilled. And I mean, in China, they can probably bring up any camera on any street of the 1.5 billion people in that country. They can do it in a second and have multiple views. I mean, they can have a whole command center, right, of people watching. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in or any individual on any individual wire was guesswork. So you don't. The point here is nobody really knows exactly how this regime works. Its concealment is part of its power. People don't know really what goes on in their own regime. This happens in our government all the time. When laws are being passed and decisions being made, they almost always happen behind closed doors. We never see the real discussion, which speaks to the real motivations and what's really in. I mean, let me ask you this. How many have you ever read legislation that's come out of Congress, right? Many bills are 800, 1,000 pages long. And you know who doesn't? It's not only you who doesn't read the bills. It's also the people in Congress who pass them. That's stunning. And in many cases, they haven't even written them directly. Well, if the legislators don't write the legislation, who writes it? Well, that's a good question. And I'm not going to tell you. Go learn about it. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug in your wire whenever they wanted to. So here you see the principle of Panopticon Ism. You had to did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. This sentence right here is exactly the principle of Panopticonism. You had to live and download into your psychological calculus the belief that you were constantly being surveilled. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as he well knew, even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grim landscape. So the only buildings that have any kind of glory to them are the government buildings, right? In our country, that's not the case. Actually, most of our government buildings are pretty unimaginative and not terribly beautiful. And in fact, it's a lot of the private sector buildings that are the spectacular ones. This, he thought, was a sort of vague distaste. This, he thought, with a sort of vague distaste. This was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been this way, had always been quite like this. He's trying to squeeze out a childhood memory. Now we find out that he's trying to literally, quote unquote, squeeze it out by writing it into a book, and he's trying to squeeze it out of his mind and his recollection because he has no reference point to be able to remember what his childhood was like. Were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with bulks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard, and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bomb sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air, and the willow herb straggled over the heaps of rubble, and the places where the bombs had cleared a larger path, and there had sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. They live like chickens in a kind of prison cage, right? So this is a dilapidated third world existence, and what it really looks like, being written in 1949, it really looks like the rubble of significant parts of London as a result of Hitler's bombing of London, the Battle of London that happened over a period of a few years and really decimated parts of London. And the point is, we don't really know, this is 1984 now in the book, we don't really know what brought about this rubble? Was it World War II that then transferred into some other kind of conflict? Or is it the subsequent war with Eurasia or East Asia, right? And why has it never been fixed? Why is it permanently left in a state of dilapidation, right? And think about the psychological effect of a proud nation like England, a civilized nation like England, living in a permanent state of decay, and the kind of psychological degradation that would wreak on a people. And I think that's exactly what's being described here, the psychological impact of this kind of decrepit world that he's living in. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright-lit tableaux occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. So he can't remember his childhood because any reference point has been stripped away by which he would remember it, like people, like places, like pictures, like friends. They're gone. What's meant by a bright-lit tableau that have no background, or I think the word here is context? He has disparate images, flashbacks of his childhood, but he can't place those pictures in the larger context that would actually give them meaning, right? One cannot have meaning without the relationships between things. To have these discrete images that don't have any obvious connection, it makes them completely unintelligible and therefore meaningless, and therefore he can't put together a coherent tapestry or narrative of his own life. Page 4. The Ministry of Truth, Mini-True, as it's known in Newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure with glittering white concrete, soaring up terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out of the white face in elegant lettering, the 3 slogans of the party. War is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Right? So, Mini-True, Newspeak not only eliminates words, but it simplifies the language so as to eliminate the nuance, to eliminate the ability to make fine-grained discriminations about our own experience and our own feelings. And it's a kind of like bureaucraties. It's like if you get in or read enough about the government or various types of business, they have all kinds of like abbreviated expressions. And then the Ministry of Truth is where he works. It's a pyramidal structure. I mean, it's which is to say, it's like an Egyptian pyramid with white gleaming surface, concrete, glittering. Like what kind of structure is that in like a modern, Western city? That's very odd, right? And on it says, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Well, of course, right? Isn't that obvious that freedom is slavery? And slavery is freedom too, right? So this is part of Newspeak, and something that's derived from Newspeak is doublethink, in which the very meanings of words are made to mean opposite what they actually mean. And these slogans are part of the psychic control and kind of drilled into people for the duration. Ministry of Truth is a great example of doublespeak, because of course it's the ministry of propaganda and falsehood, right? The Ministry of Truth contained, it was said, 3,000 rooms above ground level and corresponding ramifications below. Scattered about London, there were just 3 other buildings of similar appearance and size. So completely did they dwarf the surrounding architecture that from the roof of Victory Mansions you could see all 4 of them simultaneously. They were the homes of the 4 ministries between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. the Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. Now notice how connected in our world, education, the media, Hollywood, and the arts, it's stunning how they all promote the same messages. And they don't, places precisely in our society that you'd think would be the sites of freedom of thought, freedom to disagree, are typically have been the sites of intellectual conformity and dogmatism. You have to wonder why that is the case. The Ministry of Love, which preaches hate, which maintains law and order, right? So what is that? That's like the FBI police department, right? It's called the Ministry of Love. That's appropriate, right? If you say it enough, it makes sense, right? And the Ministry of Plenty, well, you can see that's the economic division, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names in newspeak, Mini True, Mini Pax, Mini Love, and Mini Plenty, right? That sounds wonderful. It's all wrapped up in a little bow with the language. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. There were no windows in it at all. Winston had never been inside the Ministry of Love, nor within half a kilometer of it. It was a place impossible to either enter except on official business, and then only by penetrating through a maze of barbed wire entanglements, steel doors, and hidden machine gun hests. Even the street leading to it, its outer barriers, were roamed by gorilla-faced guards in black uniforms, armed with jointed truncheons, like a kind of a nightstick, right, or a billy club. Now, the Ministry of Love here is clearly given the central focus. It's mysterious. Nobody really knows what goes on there. Winston doesn't really know what goes on there, but he has a general idea that it is the law enforcement operation, and it's likely the home of the thought police. So law enforcement is really not about, physical compulsion. It's really about thought and mind control, right? It's also pertinent because this story is a love story about these two characters having an attempted real love. Not the Ministry of Love, that's clearly a euphemism. That's newspeak for hate or for control. So now I'm going to pick up at the bottom of page 5. For some reason, the telescreen in the living room was in an unusual position. Instead of being placed, as was normal, at the end wall, where it could command the whole room, it was in the longer wall opposite the window, right? So he's in an oblong rectangular room, and instead of putting it at the small wall, it would be like the head of a long table that could then surveil the whole room. It was put on the wide wall, so then when it looks out, it's leaving gaps in the room where it can't surveil the entire room. And this gives Winston the sense that he can conceal himself. To one side of it, there was a shallow alcove. An alcove is like a niche, a little space one can kind of fit into, in which Winston was now sitting, and which, when the flats were built, had probably been intended to hold bookshelves. So this scene from the movie that you see on the screen here is essentially the depiction of this opening scene of the book. It's not architecturally identical, but you can see the basic parallel of this little place that he feels is away from the telescreen. Now notice there used to be a bookshelf there. Two things. The bookshelf is gone because people aren't allowed to have all kinds of books. And two, it also indicates Winston's general love of language, English language, of words, ideas, and the truth that they can represent. And that the bookshelf is associated with something about his identity. By sitting in the alcove and keeping well back, Winston was able to remain outside the range of the telescreen so far as sight went. He could be heard, of course, but so long as he stayed in the present position, he could not be seen. It was partly the unusual geography of the room, that had suggested to him the thing that he was now about to do. Okay, so his belief that he has a space removed from the Panopticon allows him, you might say, to express himself and to engage in an activity that he knows is going to be controversial, he knows would get him in trouble. But it allows him to start this diary that represents a psychic space away from the control of the regime, and a place, a kind of a garden, if you will, where he can cultivate his own identity freely, right? And he does it in this diary, right? We'll find out later on that this act of intellectual rebellion against the regime will be his own downfall in being a traitor to the regime. But it had also been suggested by the book that he had just taken out of the drawer. It was a peculiarly beautiful book. Now that's important. It's a book. People don't have many books. And two, it's beautiful. Everything in this world we've seen is ugly. And it's not just beautiful because it's physically beautiful. Beauty represents here its appeal to him. It's appeal to him because it's a psychic space that's liberated from the regime's control and surveillance. Its smooth, creamy paper, a little yellowed by age, was of a kind that had not been manufactured for at least 40 years past. We start to learn in the course of the book that it was sometime around 40 years prior that something fundamentally changed in the regime. And there's a question of what was prior to 40 years ago. It was a different way of life. And I think probably what we're talking about is England looked very much like the England that we know today. A free country fighting fascism and so on and so forth. 1984, if you go back 40 years, you get 1944, a year prior to the end of, we just celebrated Victory in Europe Day, as I'm sure you all know. Victory in Europe over the Nazis, and later we'd have victory in Asia over the Japanese. So something happened toward the end of World War II that instead of going on a path toward freedom, they went on a path toward this kind of tyranny. And this is disturbingly inexplicable, given that this book is written in 1949 in the aftermath of this great glorious victory of freedom over tyranny that is World War II, right? Everybody characterizes that as the good war. So what happened? And why, as a journalist, is Orwell painting such an ominous picture of the future? In any case, you know, his parents, we discover, have been killed. And that was the generation of people who saw this world, what it could be like before this totalitarian regime. So that explains exactly why they had to go, because they had seen too much of the world. And if you're going to habituate people to this form of slavery, you cannot present them any alternatives that look rosier, because then you'll give them psychic motivation to rebel, right? I'll give you a parallel in the story of that Frederick Douglass, the slave that we read, writes about his own life. He initially gets taught how to read while he's living in Baltimore, and he's too young to do the kind of serious labor that slaves did, say, on a plantation. And he's a playmate for a white slave master, and the wife of the master starts teaching him how to read. And when the master, the male or patriarch of the household, gets wind of this, he says to the wife, "You cannot teach this man to read." And the reason, and he says it explicitly, he will get ideas. He will see that there is a world other than the world of slavery. And he will then, once he sees that world, a kind of promised land, he will not want slavery. So slavery is always predicated on ignorance. You must keep the slave ignorant. You give them ideas, you're giving them alternatives, other points of view. You're cultivating their thinking faculty. And remember one of the mantras of this regime is ignorance is not slavery, but ignorance is strength. And I would argue that what ignorance really is slavery, right? He could guess, however, that the book was much older than that. He had seen it lying in the window of a frowsy little junk shop in a slummy quarter of the town. Just what quarter he did not now remember. And he had been stricken immediately by an overwhelming desire to possess it. Now, there's many interesting things in this passage. The frowsy little junk shop where he purchased this is Sherrington's shop, number one. Number two, he has an appreciation of beautiful things. Why? Because human beings have an appreciation intrinsically, naturally, for beautiful things. And notice what this desire, this appreciation of its beauty led to. He wanted to possess it. He wanted to have it for himself. Now this is straight out of the Symposium, that erotic desire culminates in the desire for possession of the thing that you find pleasurable or beautiful. Party members were supposed not to go into ordinary shops, dealing on the free market, it was called. Free market, that's capitalism. But the rule, so the proles, this is a prole shop, right? They live on a level of society where it's the most degraded, but there's the least control of them. And part of the reason they're not controlled directly is because they live such a degraded life, or a degraded life, that no one believes that they represent a threat, right? And in a sense, they are controlled because they're not given access to the regime. They're not given access to any opportunities whatsoever. Party members were not supposed to go into ordinary shops, dealing on the free market, it was called, but the rule was not strictly kept, because there were various things, such as shoelaces and razor blades, which it was impossible to get hold of in any other way. I mean, this describes what the Soviet Union was like in their shortages of basic goods, and like you had to use the black market to get basic goods, and you had to be connected with people. You were forced to break the rules to get the basic necessities of life. He had given a quick glance up and down the street, and then he slipped inside and bought the book for $2.50. At the same time, he was not conscious of wanting it for any particular purpose. So he just wanted it because it was pretty. He had carried it guiltily home in his briefcase, even with nothing written in it. It was a compromising possession. This is evidence of his own criminality against the state, right? He has already set down the path of being in major conflict with the regime, and we're just going to see it unfold. He is. Let's be clear. He's a thought criminal. He's a thought criminal. The thing that he was about to do was to open a diary. That is a crime. This was not illegal. Well, we'll see why it's not illegal. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal, since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that he would be punished by death, or at least 25 years in a forced labor camp. So when he says it's not illegal, it doesn't mean that it was legal, right? There were no laws. Whatever the regime decides is against the rules, is against the rules. And it's what you call the arbitrary authority. The rule of law signifies a common set of rules that everyone is aware of, that everyone has to follow, interpreted in the same way. That is the essence of the rule of law. Arbitrary authority is, the king says, the way you blew your nose today should result in capital punishment, because he feels like it, right? So clearly the simple logic of the rules is that if you do anything that's threatening to the regime, you're going to suffer consequences. But they have no expressed or explicit system of laws that's written down anywhere. And that makes it easier because it's a form of concealment. You don't know what you could do that's going to get you in trouble. You just have a sense of it. You don't know, right? And arbitrary authority is the essence of tyranny, going back, political analysis going back to the beginning of political science with Plato and Aristotle. The most diabolical form of regime does not have the uniform rule of law. You have the rule of a tyrant, or in this case, it's the party. It's the party. So they can criminalize any behavior if they decide that they don't like you, right? It has certain echoes today. Winston fitted a nib into the pen holder and sucked it to get the grease off. The pen was an archaic instrument, seldom used even for signatures, and he had procured one furtively and with some difficulty simply because of the feeling that the beautiful creamy paper deserved to be written on with a real nib instead of being scratched with an ink pencil. Right? So he doesn't have a ballpoint pen. He's got this old-fashioned, it's like a 19th century or anything. And nobody writes anymore, right, by hand. And of course, this is the world we live in, because why everybody has computers. He in his office, he has a thing called a SpeakWrite, where he speaks into it and it translates his speech into words. Now, I mean, in the last few years, we've gotten that technology on, Word, Microsoft Word. But I mean, is he imagining something out of whole cloth, or is he aware of some technology that back in 1949 could do something like that? It's an interesting question. Actually, he was not used to writing by hand. Apart from very short notes, it was usual to dictate everything into the SpeakWrite, which was, of course, impossible for the present purpose. Because, of course, when you speak in the SpeakWrite, it's all being recorded and archived by the regime. And that's what he uses at work at the Ministry of Truth. He dipped the pen into the ink and then faltered for just a second. A tremor had gone through his bowels. To mark the paper was his decisive act. In small, clumsy letters he wrote, April 4th, 1984. He sat back. A sense of complete helplessness had descended upon him. To begin with, he did not know with any certainty that it was 1984. It must be around about that date, since he was fairly sure that his age was 39, and he believed that he had been born in 1944 or 1945, but it was never possible nowadays to pin down any date within a year or two. Now, first of all, the impending doom. He knows he's just committed, well, for lack of a better word, a crime, a thought crime, even though there are no laws. Second of all, he doesn't, and so this moment, he is now an enemy of the state. And this is only going to develop as we go forward here. The second thing is he doesn't even know what the date is. This society, by concealing the most basic facts and not having the most basic structure to life, is utterly disorienting. People can't place things in relationship to one another, and therefore they can't make sense of the world around them. Not because they're stupid, but because they don't have the markers in time. And of course, if the regime can change what's written in its newspapers, it can also change the time, right? I mean, yes, the sun comes up and sun goes down, but dates and things like that are a human contrivance that you could easily see being altered to suit the regime. For whom, it suddenly occurred to him to wonder, was he writing this diary? For the future, for the unborn? No, he's writing it for himself. His mind hovered for a moment round the doubtful date on the page, and then fetched up with a bump against the newspeak word doublethink. For the first time the magnitude of what he had undertaken came home to him. How could he communicate with the future? It was of its nature impossible. Either the future would resemble the past, in which case it would not listen to him, or it would be indifferent from it, and his predicament would be meaningless. What do? he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. And therefore, how is this document going to persist and have any meaning to anyone? Even if itself is not changed, the facts around his life, the facts around the regime, can always be altered to make this document mean whatever the regime needs it to mean. One more paragraph here and we'll conclude. Bottom of page 7. For some time he sat gazing stupidly at the paper. The telescreen had changed over to strident military music. It was curious that he seemed not merely to have lost the power of expressing himself, but even to have forgotten what it was that he had originally intended to say. Through all the various types of control in this regime, that inner voice that we have that expresses our true identity and that reflects on our own histories, that inner voice is constantly being disrupted and altered and suppressed. So the act of self-expression is a radical act here, and this is what this diary represents, an act of, and we think of self-expression in the most trivial ways of like, Lady Gaga, look at me, right? Here we're talking about simply articulating our own distinct point of view as our own. Communist society is predicated on collectivism. Collectivism denies the worth and value of the identity of the individual. And therefore it actively seeks to cultivate that identity out of the people through the clothes, through the surveillance, through the propaganda. You are just a kind of robot of the regime. That is the kind of ideal, especially if it's mind control rather than just controlling one's body, right? So he has to work to undo the layers that have been imposed on him by the society, to dig down into himself, to find anything at all, and that is why he's so uncertain about what he's trying to say or how to say it. One, because he can't find the content, and two, this self-expression is not what's done. It says, for weeks past, he had been making ready for this moment, and it had never crossed his mind that anything would be needed except courage. The actual writing would be easy. All he had to do was to transfer to paper the interminable, restless monologue that had been running inside his head, literally for years. At this moment, however, even the monologue had dried up. So, let's be clear what this monologue is in his head and the implications. On the most basic level, this monologue in his head is the running voice of narrating our own life that we all engage in as human beings because we have language to represent our life and our world to ourselves. For him, it's that, obviously, but it's also a very unusual act of a type of human being within this regime who is not the average person, who is trying to reconstruct their own true life from the lies they've been told and establish a realm of kind of autonomy from the propaganda being imposed on him and to bring about his own real identity. And what does that make him? It makes him a criminal, because he's doing something by definition that's a threat to the regime, because the real form of control here is controlling one's own understanding of the world, and including in that oneself. So this act and this attitude and concern he has is the seed kernel for everything that happens in the text, and it is the conflict for him. It is the thing that's put him in conflict with the regime. His personal conflict is, who am I? In light of what the society has attempted to do to my identity. And then that snowballs into a direct conflict with the powers that be, because this is something that's going to be strictly forbidden and a threat to this order of things.